Hello, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center Livable Communities webinar. Today's webinar is titled, Creating Great Communities Through Public Involvement, How to Create and Run Effective Advisory and Advocacy Groups, and we will be speaking with Peter Lagerwey, Seattle Regional Office Director for Tool Design Group. This is the second of two webinars exploring how to leverage community support to build more livable communities. My name is James Gallagher, and I am the PBIC Communications Manager. I will be facilitating today's webinar. For more information on future webinars or to view the archives from this webinar series and others, please visit pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. You can also stay abreast of PBIC webinars by following us on Facebook at facebook.com/pedbike. In addition to these webinars, PBIC also offers 4 different in-person training courses to provide technical assistance to professionals and community members in developing pedestrian safety action plans and improving conditions for walking. These courses can be found at pedbikeinfo.org/gettraining.
So there'll be 2 parts to today's presentation. The first focuses on how to create and run an effective advisory board. The second part, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to create an effective advocacy group. So first one, again, is how to create an effective advisory board. The topics I'm going to cover today are why and when to create an official board, go over some of the challenges and benefits, specifically what do you need to do to create an advisory board, and also how to be an effective board. And I think that last point is particularly important because a lot of communities have a pedestrian or a bicycle advisory board or together, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but a lot of times they're not very effective. And one of the things that I've learned over time, and again why I'm so interested in this particular topic, is those communities that change over time and become great places to walk, great places to bicycle, are communities that get the public involvement part of things right. And a big part of that is getting an official pedestrian and or bike advisory board not only together, but to make sure that it works well. And they can be really wonderful, but they can also easily become dysfunctional and not really serve the community very well. So those are the kinds of things I would like to address. So in terms of why create an official board, it gets back to the what everyone's heard many times, is partly the process is the product. So the process of creating an official board, which is ongoing, so it's not only a matter of creating it, but it's a matter then of appointing people to it, is it increases awareness among decision makers. So they have to act on it, they have to appoint people, and so it's really a way of just elevating the issues related to walking and bicycling a little bit higher. And one of the things we know is a lot of times when walking and bicycling issues are not addressed, it isn't because people are anti that. It's quite often they just weren't aware of it, didn't think about it. So really this is part of a general awareness awakening. By the way, and I'll get into this more in a little bit, but it's really important that when you create an official board, it be official. In other words, create it legislatively or through director's rule, but some way that makes it ongoing. Otherwise, you get a change in leadership, and it can easily go away. So it's really important that you really elevate the importance. Second reason to create an official board, again, it relates to longevity and the vulnerability of political changes, which I was just alluding to. The mayor changes, the city council changes, the director of a department changes, the city manager changes, and they may or may not have that same interest in walking or bicycling. So by having it legislatively official, it creates that institutional continuity that allows you to survive changes in the local political scene. And the other is establishing credibility and legitimacy. And this is really important. When it's official, you're more likely to be listened to, and most boards are advisory, underlining the word advisory. So to be legitimate, a couple things. One is that it has to be created officially, and then the second thing, and I'll talk more about this a little bit later, but it's really important that the board look like the community. In other words, it has to have the diversity that's reflected in the community, reflected on the board, create that credibility and legitimacy. So again, some of the benefits of having a pedestrian or bike advisory board. One I think is really important is transparency. And where the transparency comes in is that board agendas, board meeting minutes, the meetings themselves are all open to the public, should be put online so that there's really an openness about how decisions are made. I think quite often there's some distrust between the public and transportation agencies because it feels like a mystery. It's hard to figure out what's going on. And so this is one more way where we can create transparency both in government decision making and how they relate to local citizens. So this is a very important piece of that. Another benefit is just community buy-in. It's a place where you can go and present ideas if the board endorses something. And if that board is really representative of the community, it's a way to get community buy-in for transportation projects. It's also a place where you can go and try innovation. Sometimes you want to try something new. There's a new idea here out, a best practice, and you want to try to, say, put a new design element on the ground. Sometimes going through a pedestrian or bike advisory board is a way to get, again, that community buy-in, that support, and permission to go forward and try some innovative kinds of things. And then the other is it really provides a forum to have a conversation between transportation staff and the community. And that's, again, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but that's why having open meetings, having a diverse group that represents the community and really make it welcoming, again, helps the transparency and really makes that connection. Some of the challenges that come up, and I think that knowing that typically boards have this challenge allows you to deal with it ahead of time. One is just sort of the relationship between the board and the staff, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this on a subsequent slide. But it really looks at, how do you staff a board and what should the board be doing? And sometimes one of the challenges is that it becomes overly staff dependent, where the board just gets information from a staff person and demands more and more information, and it takes too much staff time. Staff get grumpy because it's just taking too much time. Boards get grumpy because they don't feel like they're getting what they want. And so it can start creating some tension. In general, the less staff time you put into this and the more the board takes responsibility for all of its own work, the happier and better off everyone will be. Now, there's some very important things that staff needs to do, and I'll go over those in a minute, but it should not be, a half-time job for somebody. It should be more in the neighborhood of 1 day a month kind of thing, 8-10 hours a month, in terms of, say, working with a board that meets once a month. So it certainly takes staff time, but it should not be something that takes all the staff time. If it does, you probably haven't figured out the roles and responsibilities correctly. And it's kind of interesting. I always find that there's the most tension between members and staff in those situations where the board members are doing very little and the staff is doing too much. One of the other challenges with all boards is sort of the tension between long-term goals and sort of now projects. And one of the things that I do, and I think this is what a staff person needs to do, is when you work with a board, you really need some sort of short, medium, and long-term kinds of things you work on. Some of the short-term things need to be done because by having success in the short term, it gives you the motivation to be able to focus on some of the medium and longer term. So you do need some sort of immediate gratification, if you will, but the short-term things that you work on also then need to feed into and support the longer-term goals. Excuse me. So there's a lot of short-term things you can do, and you have to make some strategic decisions as a board. What are you going to work on? So even the short-term things you do should fit into what your long-term goals are. And I'll talk a little bit more about vision and goals for a board, but it really needs to have that continuity. The last point here, again, challenges, active or passive. It gets back to what I was alluding to earlier. Passive boards are unhappy. They're sort of waiting for things to be given them. Active boards move forward. And of course, the question becomes, how do you move from a passive board to an active board? One of the things I've already hinted at is sort of the relationship between staff and the board, and I'll address that more a little bit later. The other one is to really have good training for a board. I don't think you can have a good board without at least once a year spending a half day, Saturday, something like that, and doing a workshop on setting goals, setting up the structure, figuring out who's going to do what, and really having a purposeful way of moving forward, keeping track of what you do so that at the end of a year you feel like your time has been very, very well spent. One of the biggest challenges of any board is to keep people interested, engaged, and active in the board, and really documenting your successes and the good things you do is one of the most important things you can do to keep people active. So some steps to actually create an advisory board. I already mentioned that you want to get official recognition and support, and depending on whether the kind of local government you have, that may vary. But typically it's going to be something in like a resolution passed by your county, city council, something like that. When you do create a board, it's really important to recruit and interview members. One of the mistakes that a lot of boards make is they send out a notice to a whole bunch of different groups and say, send us somebody. Well, you're going to get the 10 people who are on every other board and commission already in your local area, and it may or may not represent the community, and it may or may not be a functional group. And so there's nothing wrong, and I'll have a slide on this in a minute, with, say, targeting people from certain groups, but you still want to recruit and interview individual members. So typically what I suggest is you put a notice out, just like a job description. You ask people to send in a resume, and you ask them to do an interview. And it's nice if you can interview 2 people or 3 people for every position, and that really allows you to get the kind of diversity on your board of different kinds of cyclists, it needs to look like the community so that when you do the interview process. Also, too, is if people have to put some energy into getting on a board, they're more likely to participate and stay active on a board if it doesn't cost them anything, if they just get appointed to a board because they helped on a campaign or something, may or may not ever show up. So the more that you can make people work a little bit to get on a board, the better off you're going to be in the long run. Just as an aside, when you do interview people, usually what I do is try to have somebody already on the board, and then have a second person, say, who's the staff person, and then a third person representing, say, a mayor's office or a city manager's office or city council, whoever is going to do the appointing. So you have like 2 or 3 people in the interview, and typically what I like to do is tell people, okay, we have 5 questions and we have 20 minutes, and we'll go from here. So if you ask the first question and somebody talks for 25 minutes, probably not a good person to the board, because it shows they didn't listen very well, they didn't manage their time, and they're looking for the board as a platform for their particular issue. Closely related to that is I usually ask people, just very simply, why do you want to be on the board? And if it's strictly a backyard issue, in other words, I want to join this board because I've been trying to get a stop sign at this and this intersection, for 8 years, nobody listens to me, and I want to get on the board to get my stop sign. That kind of person is probably not going to be a good board member, because they get their stop sign and they go away. They're just focused on that one issue. So you really want people with a broader perspective. a good answer would be is, I'd like to work with the city. I know they're reviewing their stop sign policies and where to put them, where not to put them, and be involved in that. In other words, something of a bigger picture, so that becomes important. Also, under creating an advisory board, just again, it's really important to determine what kind of logistical support is going to be provided to the board in terms of staffing. I talked about that. Who's going to send out meeting notices, who's going to take minutes, who's going to set the agendas, that kind of thing. And again, usually what I suggest is the staff person, say, meet with the chair once a month, kind of work together on putting together the agenda. But I think the agenda should come out from the chair, and also the meeting notes should come out from the chair, so that it really messages that there's trust here, and that this is a board that's stepping forward and being proactive. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but how you set up agendas and how you do a meeting becomes very, very important, but I'll cover that in a subsequent slide. So getting back to recruiting and interviewing members, here are some of the considerations. One is sort of the size of the board, and usually 9 to 11 members is going to be best. I usually recommend 11. One of the things that you really want to look at, if it's too small, if 1 or 2 people is missing at a meeting, it sort of breaks down, and you may not have enough people to deal with all the issues that need to be dealt with. If it gets too big, it gets sort of dysfunctional, and quite often just 2 or 3 people will dominate. So in general, I always recommend somewhere between 9, 10, 11 people. I've already talked about the importance of diversity and the fact that the board needs to look like the community. It also needs to look like the bicycling community. In other words, you need people who do the century rides on one end, and then you need people on the other end who only bike on weekends, say, with their kids, and they just go a mile or 2 and maybe pull a cart. So you really need the whole range of kinds of cyclists that are on. I talked a little bit about the member qualities and the member selection in terms of you really want people with a broader vision for the larger community. One I didn't talk about is leadership. Having a good chair is absolutely critical to having a good board, and looking for people who really understand what it means to be a leader, to be a leader that embraces and involves all members. And there's nothing wrong with calling somebody and asking them to apply to be on a board if you know they're really good leaders, they might be interested. That's the one where you may want to actually do some targeted outreach to get a good person who can lead the group and really make it an effective organization. I mentioned before you should not go to different groups like neighborhood groups and just say, send us your person. That said, when you start interviewing people, you probably want to make sure that in some way or another, some of these groups, and you can see the list here, are involved. So when you get people applying to be on the board and you go through the list, you might want to look at it and say, okay, there's some people here who represent neighborhood groups, business groups, other advocacy groups. So that's the basic idea behind it, is that you don't go to those groups, but you want to make sure that in some way they're represented because they are part of that larger community. Some of the things just to think about is the relationship between a board and other agencies. Some boards work very well with other agency people actually on the board. I tend to think it works a little bit better if you don't do that and you keep them kind of independent. Though these other agencies obviously need to be frequent visitors to the board because almost all local jurisdictions have multiple levels of transportation agencies. Could be state, could be county, could be local. Quite often there's overlapping transit providers, various health departments. So these are all people or organizations that will be important to be involved in the board. You can make a call whether you want actual representatives on the board. My personal opinion is that it tends to work better if you can have a board just made up of citizens and then figure out other ways to involve these other agencies. So just some of the logistics of running a good board. I already mentioned that it's absolutely critical to have a good chairperson. In terms of a staff person, next one on the list here is the staff liaison. It's really important that the staff meet with the chair once a month. It could be a breakfast meeting for lunch or something. But I found that being able to work with a chair is really key to having an effective board. And I've mentioned that the staff should not spend too much time on a board. So you have to choose, where you spend your time. Choosing to spend an hour a month with the chair is one of the most important things you can do. On the board, you'll need a scribe or note taker, and again, it should be somebody on the board who takes those notes and somebody who can be good at that. From time to time, there's quite often going to be subcommittees. I've mentioned that next one here, sort of technical topic leads. Quite often, there will be 1, 2, or 3 people on a board who can actually read, technical, technical kinds of drawings and say drawings for building something or something like that. So people are really familiar with that kind of detail. Maybe a subcommittee, I just put it there as an example, and I've done it where I'll have 2 or 3 technical people maybe meet before a board meeting and kind of review design drawings and plans and then report to the larger group. Usually it doesn't work real well to bring technical drawings to the whole group, but so just a way to get you thinking about different kinds of subcommittees. Sometimes, too, it makes sense for board members to be liaisons to other committees. So, for example, if you had a pedestrian advisory board and then separate from that there was another committee, say, related to, say, Safe Routes to School, and the Safe Routes to School was putting in a lot of sidewalks and curb ramps and other walking kinds of things, it may make sense for one of the pedestrian advisory board members to also then be a liaison, at least attend and report to, say, another committee that's, say, a pedestrian advisory committee, or excuse me, a Safe Routes to School committee. So that kind of liaison, working with other committees, can easily lead to too many meetings, so you've got to be careful with this, but it's something that can be very, very effective in terms of coordinating efforts. So some of the other logistics, and I've alluded to some of these before, staff support, I've already mentioned training. Once a year, staff should set up a training for the board and really get them focused so they really feel like they're getting a lot done and help them to be effective. I think it's always important to remember that they're volunteers. They're giving of their most valuable resource, which is their time. And one of the fundamental responsibilities of the staff is to give people on the board the information they need so they can be effective in what they're doing. In other words, help them to use their time in a way that's honors that time and honors the fact they're giving them that time and allows them to be effective in what they're doing. It's not telling them what to do, but it's saying, here's the opportunities where you can be effective. Some of the board responsibilities, and again, I've alluded to this before, taking minutes, setting agendas. I just want to make a comment here, though, about inviting speakers. And I'll touch on this in a minute when we talk about agendas. But every single meeting should have a special presentation. In other words, an outside speaker. And the reason simply is this, is that you want to make sure that there's a reason to come to every meeting. If you miss a meeting, you're going to miss something really important because there's a speaker there. And it really keeps the energy going. A speaker related to a particular, it could be a policy document, it could be a plan of some sort. It could be a specific project that's going forward. One of the jobs, too, of the person staffing the board is to prep the speaker. A lot of people I found out are very uncomfortable speaking in front of a pedestrian or bike advisory board. They don't like public speaking in the first place, and they always feel like they're going to go there and get beat up, so to speak. And so whenever there's a speaker, and if I've been the staff person to a board, I always meet with the speaker ahead of time, and I go up with the speaker. I don't let them hang out on their own. I tell them ahead of time kind of questions that you're likely to get, how to phrase things, and really support them. So it's a we and not a kind of them. And then again, when there's Q&A after a presentation, if I'm staffing it, I'm going to be up there with my fellow staff colleagues helping to answer the question. So you really are building good relationships, both internal to organizations and between the public and people who, and the staff. So that kind of nuanced working together becomes incredibly important. So again, getting to some of the more details here of staff support, I mentioned that staff can be involved in recruiting and interviewing new members. Again, a liaison between the agency staff and the board. So that's working with other agency staff who might present to the board. Very, very important. The next one is again, I think really important is for there to be a staff report where you provide an overview of ongoing projects that might be of interest. Again, you're not telling the board what to do as a staff person, but what you're doing is providing them the windows of when they can be effective. So, for example, if there's a new, say, transportation plan being developed, there might be certain windows where you can provide comment or go to a public meeting or go online and take a survey or do something. And it's only during that time period you can do it. And then once the time period is done, it's harder to provide input. So what a staff person can do is not say this is what you should say, but they can say, okay, this is an important, if you're interested in this project, these are the 2 weeks that you can be involved. This is how you do it if you're interested. And so it's really enabling citizens to be effective. It's not telling them what to do. A staff person can also provide some good institutional knowledge. One of the challenges of a bike board or a pedestrian board is that they provide some good input, but the project takes 3 years, 4 years. And the board has some change, some turnover. People come, people go. And then 3 years into the project, all of a sudden, there's people on the board who are going, I don't like this. I want to do something different. And so one of the frustrating things that happens from a staff point of view is that the feedback you get from a board can change over time. And that's hard to deal with when a project might take 3 or 4 years to put in. So again, a role of the staff person is to provide that institutional knowledge, help keep track of some previous board decisions, and keep reminding the board so that they stay focused and don't start drifting in all different directions within the context of a bigger project. So again, the last point there, just organizing things, posting it, creating that institutional continuity and memory. So again, some of the roles of staff, and I've alluded to these a little bit already. I talked about organizing presenters, working with presenters. The next one here is, what's the formal review process? And sometimes boards will actually come up with say a one-pager written of how they review a project. What do they look for? They might look for safety issues, for example. They might look at priority issues. They might look at accessibility issues. They might look at sort of geographic balance issues, diversity issues, equity issues, all sorts of things, ways that you can look at a project or look at priorities. So again, that's something you can work with the board on. I also already mentioned technical review. You need a couple people on a board that can really look at the technical side of things. And then, how do you provide that comment? And so, there could be written comments. What you don't want to do is run to the city council or the mayor or your city manager every time, every way. 99% of the time, you should be able to work things out with a project manager, with a project lead, and make it a collaborative kind of thing. If you end up having to run to the city council or the mayor more than once a year, probably there's not good collaborative communication going on. That should be a last resort, unless, of course, they ask you for some input. That's a whole different thing. But on a routine basis, that you don't. If you're having to run to the city council mayor all the time, it shows there's something dysfunctional about what's happening. So the detailed agenda for a successful board, bike board again, or pedestrian board, is you always want to start with some introductions. There's always people from the public there, and they need to be welcome. Sometimes they're even broadcast live. At some point, you need to provide some public comment. Usually, I like to suggest you put it at the end of the agenda, but it really, the notion of being open, the notion of really being transparent is very important. Obviously, you just have to review past meeting notes. One of the things that I like to do is to do a round robin and ask each board member to report something they've worked on in the past month, and that's just sort of basic, sort of human nature. You want to get recognized for what you do. So do a round robin, and if people have been to another meeting, if they've written something up, if they've written a letter, they've read something, let them report that. I also mentioned that it's important to have a presentation at every meeting. Make it exciting, make it cutting edge. If you miss the meeting, you're going to miss something important. And then obviously you can review specific projects. There may be other business you take care of. But again, the order of this will vary, but I think the basic ingredients are welcome introductions, report out by each member, give some recognition for the work they're doing, have a presentation, provide the feedback. So when you start, again, looking at presentations, you want to make sure that some of the things that you should expect. One is just the quality of work, and I think one of the things by inviting people to a board, I think it can boost up the quality of work that you get from agency staff and others. And I think it's really fair to have an expectation of good presentation. But from the staff side, it's also fair to expect constructive feedback again, and not, again, like I mentioned before, sort of elevating something immediately, but really make it collaborative. It can be a follow-up meeting to have some feedback, that kind of thing. And again, the board meetings themselves can be an opportunity for others also to provide input into the process. Some of the things a board should avoid is you should not be endorsing candidates or positions. You have to be the board for all the people, if you will, and the people you kind of report to are going to change. City council people change, mayors change, directors of department changes, and so you really need to be there for everyone and all the time and create that institutional continuity. I mentioned the problem of concentrating on individual pet causes. Not a good way to go. You just get lost in the weeds. You won't get much done. And so you really need to avoid losing sight of what your objectives are and looking at the bigger picture moving forward all the time. So I put the word questions up here, but I'm going to skip that for right now and then do the second half. And then we're going to do questions at the end here. So I'm going to bring up my other presentation, and I'm just going to assume that you can see it and it looks good. So I'm going to move forward here. So I talked about the creating an effective pedestrian or bike advisory board, and I want to touch on just a little bit about running an advocacy group, because they're quite different. Again, a board is sort of official, it's appointed. Advocacy groups are a little bit different and play slightly different roles. But again, very, very important in transforming your community to make it a pedestrian and bicycle-friendly community. So what I'd like to do is cover just two things here, sort of the roles of advocacy groups, and then give you a sort of a model of how 25 people can create positive change. So a few things that I'll cover again are members and key roles, sort of some of the bylaws and establishing purpose, your programming, membership and volunteers, and a little bit about communication. So you can see here it's going to be a little bit different than a board. So again, why create an advocacy group? It certainly can be a community voice for issues. Social forum. One of the things that I always stress with groups, and quite often, again, you'll want to spend a half day every year kind of putting your group together, thinking through things, being purposeful about how you spend your time. One of the most important things you can do is remember that this is also a social forum and that it needs to be fun. If it isn't fun, you're going to fall apart fairly quickly, because being involved in your community needs to be productive, it needs to be positive, and it needs to be something that really energizes people. And again, when you start looking at an advocacy, doing something on advocacy, there needs to be a need. So, don't duplicate another group. Best thing you can do is to join another group. So really look at making sure that when you do an advocacy group, it's filling a need. And again, I'm not going to spend much time here. This is sort of 101. You want to make sure that you have some of the basic people involved in terms of organizationally, so that it works smoothly. Then I want to talk just a little bit about sort of the size of a group and how to do it. I just call it the magic of 25. It could be 20, it could be 50 or 100, but I kind of like this as just a way of making a couple points and a good example. One of the challenges that I see in a lot of communities, again, is that there's just 1, 2, 3, 4 people who are the advocates. And a couple things happen that's problematic. One is that everybody's life situation changes at some point, and they move, something happens, and then if everything is just boiled down to a few people, they're gone, the bottom falls out of the advocacy community. So you really want to build that institutional capability, that capacity. You want to grow the capacity of advocacy groups. You don't want to let it reside in just a few people, because, again, they leave, and then you don't have that continuity. And guaranteed, everybody's situation changes. Also, too, if you just have a relatively few number of people doing all of the advocacy, there's a good chance they'll burn out, they'll get grumpy, they just won't be happy. Again, it has to be fun. And the other part of it is their effectiveness goes away. If you have the same person always show up at every public hearing, every city council meeting, write every letter, at some point they become dismissed, because the elected officials, the decision makers already know this person, know what they're going to say, and knowing is good. I don't want to suggest that it isn't, but it starts to convey after a while, this is one person. I don't need to listen to this one person because they don't represent anybody. So one of the things that I always suggest is to get going in a community is that you really want to have up to 25 people who are really well-informed and engaged activists. And again, looking at people's time, which is the most valuable thing people have, they're giving of their time. And so if you have 25 people and they want to use their time effectively, most people are going to have full-time other things they do. So you don't want to overwhelm them, but neither do you want to underwhelm them. So again, you want to ask people to make a commitment, but it doesn't have to be that much. So the reason I picked 25, I just thought, well, you have 52 weeks in a year, 2 weeks off for the holidays. So if you have 25 people and you all commit to saying, I just made this up, but it could be any other list. But you get the idea. A couple blog posts, some emails, some letters, phone calls, meetings. There's a lot of other different ways. But what it means is that every single week in your community, there's going to be decision makers who hear from walking advocates, cycling advocates, and it'll really create the sense that this is a community effort, something much bigger than just 1 or 2, 3 people. And also, it means that you're not going to burn out your volunteers, and that you really are going to be able to have a broader spectrum and cover a lot more issues. So it really can be an incredibly effective way of a fairly small number of people having a huge impact. Same rules apply here, of course, as with the Bike Advisory Board. You really want to make sure that your group represents the community, looks like the community, has the diversity that's reflected in your community. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the next couple here, but usually you want to make sure that you've got some bylaws. You may want to apply for nonprofit status, 501c3 or C4, that kind of thing. There's a lot of other information on that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. One of the things that I think, though, is really important is to, again, what's your vision, what are your goals and objectives, and then how do you get there, and then how do you track whether you're successful or not. And this is one of the reasons you want to get together once a year for a half day to revisit your vision, your goals, and it gets back to what I mentioned earlier, is you have short, medium, long-term things that you might be doing, but you want to make sure that everything you do, especially the short, medium-term things, fit into your longer goals. You won't be able to do everything, and so you're going to have to make tough choices about how you spend your time and how you spend what you do. Oops. And so really keeping that bigger view. The other thing that I always suggest to people is to keep a checklist of all the things that you accomplish, and at the end of the year, celebrate it. Give yourself a little report card. Give people recognition for all the good things they've done. So when you are selecting issues of what are you going to work on, don't pick the things that are impossible to win right away. You need success. So in terms of looking at community needs, there's going to be a lot of them, and you're going to have to pick ones that are doable. If your community is sort of new to walking and biking sort of advocacy, you may want to, for example, focus around, and that's why I put the picture here, issues related to safe routes to school, because it's easier to develop a community consensus around kids in schools than maybe some other issues. So you want to pick, depending on where your community is, you really want to pick some of the issues that there's going to be broad community support, assess your community, and assess your political environment. What are some of the, how feasible is this? What are some of the pitfalls? And then move from there. Because if you're successful in one area, it gives you permission to move to another area. So really thinking through the kinds of issues that you want to focus on. You'll notice the food here. If you're going to get together once a month, like I said, make it fun. But part of that is bringing good food. I used to organize, years ago, I used to organize block clubs and in a lot of inner city areas. And so we would have everyone bring some goodies to the meeting. And it was a way of ensuring that people came to the meeting, but also that it was just a great time. Incredibly good way is to build some of these things around food and really a fun opportunity to meet your neighbors, and advocacy groups can be the same thing. Always have food. Always make it a good time. And again, having regular schedules, just the basics here of any meeting. Again, have them fun. Publicize. Always publicize. You never want to get the sense that your advocacy group is in any way closed, or that new people aren't welcome, or in any way it's secretive. It really needs to be transparent. It's social. Have a place that you meet, and really give people opportunities for involvement. Sometimes you may want to think about other things. A lot of advocacy groups, say, organize special rides, that kind of thing, or a bike to work day. A lot of advocacy groups use their big ride not only as a fundraiser, but as a way to recruit new members. So you sign up for a special event, you pay a little more, and you get a membership, and at the same time you might get a discount on the event. A lot of different ways of building your organization. Again, a lot of times you can go into other areas, not just advocacy, in terms of education, like I mentioned, events, all sorts of community things that you can do in terms of everything from how to maintain your bicycle to youth classes, adult classes, celebrations, walk to work day, or excuse me, walk to school day, whatever it may be that you can get involved in. I mentioned membership and retention strategies. Again, you can tie it to special events. Obviously, you want to use social media, remind people frequently enough, but not too often enough that you kind of start to annoy them, and getting that balance. And again, I'm just going to go through a little bit quicker here because I think these are pretty commonly known kinds of things to do that just every organization needs to do. But I put them here just to say, be sure to do these things. And again, a lot of things you can do with just renewal letters and things. Allow people to renew online, but don't require it. Not everybody has access to a computer. One of the things that you'll want to think about is purposeful volunteer development in terms of developing capacity for your organization. And you also want to develop a lot of goodwill in the community. So I've seen a lot of advocacy groups do wonderful things where they'll do like a neighborhood cleanup. I've done a lot of, I'll say there's an empty lot, do a cleanup in an empty lot. Something outreach that gives your organization goodwill in the community, and then it's a way again of building that capacity and encouraging others to join your organization. And then just keeping track of things. So keep track of the volunteers, keep track of what people do. You can even write little short job descriptions if you want. But probably the most important thing here is to acknowledge people's effort. Every advocacy group needs an annual event. It could be a dinner, but some sort of recognition where people stand up, brought to the front. You give people awards, you give them plaques, you give them the recognition they deserve for good work, and that's probably one of the best things that you can do to ensure that their involvement will continue, and it also inspire others. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on fundraising here, other than to say that it's one of those things that you obviously need to do as an advocacy group. And you can read the list here. That's sort of a whole separate topic, but it's obviously something you need to do. I think the main thing I just want to leave here is that it's easy for an advocacy group to get so overwhelmed and focus on fundraising. That's all they do. And so it really needs to be there. It really, again, it's a separate webinar on how to do this. But really, I think, be aware of how much time it takes, what's effective. And whenever you do fundraising, you want to make sure that you're accomplishing other things related to the organization, i.e. publicity, building capacity, bringing more people in, accomplishing a whole bunch of other things within the context of fundraising. And you can just see the list here of some of the things you can do. Again, I'm not going to get into the details here, but again, just be really aware of it and be very strategic and thoughtful about your fundraising and how you can use it to accomplish multiple goals and meet the vision of your group. And then communications, there's a right spot to be. When you use websites, social media, contacting people, if it's too often, it's like crying wolf too often, people start ignoring you, there's going to be a right number of times you contact. So if you have your group of 25, think about twice a month, something like that, 3 times a month. You don't want to be, if it's too much, people won't read anything. If it's too little, people won't feel connected. So again, have that conversation in your group and then figure out what works for you. And again, some of the things that you can do in terms of just staying in touch with people. I like the vest here. There's other things you can do also in terms of just getting the word out about your group. The other thing, and I just put this one in here because this is something that when you do have your sort of annual training get together, some things that you want to review. Again, you want to look at your goals, what's your institutional process for getting things done, who are your allies, and then timing again, providing input at the right time again is key. So that's it. And James, I'll turn it back over to you for any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Pete. All right, so now we have some time for questions. Please enter your questions into the box on your screen if you've not done so already. But to start, the first question I got, Pete, is how do you suggest selecting the chair of an advisory committee? Can the staff person choose the best candidate, or should it be a vote of the full board?
Well, it's going to be a combination. On the one hand, I think a board needs to select a chair, but at the other hand, doing some work ahead of time to help find a chair, I think is really good. There's nothing wrong, like I said, of recruiting people who might be good chairs and chatting with people. I'll frequently call somebody up and say, we need a chair. I know you've done a good job before. This is the amount of work it would be. We got these exciting projects done, and would you apply for the board? So you can influence to the extent that you get good folks to make applications to a board, go through that application process I described, and there's nothing wrong with having 2 or 3 people who might be willing to be chair, because one can be vice chair and then be in training for the next year. So the board does need to choose it at the end of the day, but I think actively being involved in a little bit and getting some of the right people on the board, I think is perfectly fine.
All right. My next question, can a joint pedestrian and bicycle advisory committee work, or do you think they should be separate? And would the size of a town factor into that, or whether there's a history of advocacy or lack of history of an advocacy on those issues?
I knew that question was coming, and it's a really good question. It's not an easy question. One of the challenges, of course, is if you have a joint pedestrian and bicycle advisory board, is there's a tendency for the boards to become just bicycle advisory boards. And part of that is just the history of bicycling, where advocacy has a longer history. More people identify themselves as bicycling advocates than walking advocates. And so there is that danger. So if your community, and this gets back to the size of the community, it's a very good question, is if your community is large enough that they can support 2 boards, I would encourage you to have 2 separate boards. In small communities, I think that can be hard. And so I think if you have a joint pedestrian and bicycle advisory board, and it's going to be together, I think you have to go in recognizing that this could be a challenge, and that's where when you do your recruiting and you bring your board together, it's so important to be very purposeful in getting a balance of people who are interested in the biking side and the walking side, both on the committee, and really be aware and purposeful about that on an ongoing basis. So you can make it work. It just takes a little more work.
All right, thank you. Next question. You mentioned monthly meetings for the advisory board. How long do you recommend each meeting be? A half day, a couple hours, a half hour?
Yeah, I think when you're dealing with volunteer time, you're probably looking at an evening meeting. And, you know, I think I kind of like 2 hours. It's enough to get a fair amount done, but it doesn't overly tax the system. And then what 2 hours allows you to do is what I alluded to a little bit is if you want to have, say, a technical meeting or a subcommittee meeting before that, sometimes it's really easy to do. So say you meet from 7 to 9 on a Wednesday evening, you could have a subcommittee meeting at 6 or 6:30, get together and then report to the board when the full board comes in. So, you know, set it up that allows you to piggyback some of the subcommittee work with the main board, so people don't have to go out 2 evenings. They can just have 1 evening, something like that. So that's generally what I would recommend. And then, like I said, is once a year, maybe twice a year, you do a longer 4-hour meeting, maybe a Saturday morning or something like that, where you do some of the other things I talked about.
All right. The next question. You said to identify your allies. What about your detractors? How would you approach addressing or handling your detractors?
Yeah, you know, one of the things I failed to mention, just as a general rule of thumb, is sort of how you present to the community. And if you're always negative, you're going to have a lot of detractors. And I always tell people follow the 3-1 rule. And what that means is that you have to say 3 thank yous, good jobs for every you do better, every whine, if you will. And so one of the ways of dealing with detractors is to message that if they're doing something you're happy with, they're gonna get recognized for it. So I think it's sort of a I don't know, a peaceful way, I guess, of addressing that. And I've seen a lot of, for example, sometimes there's tension between some public works folks and an advocacy group. Every public works department does some great things, and so one of the first things the advocacy group should do, if they feel like their public works are detractors, is find 2 or 3 things that they do well, send a thank you note, send it to the mayor, and really you know, kind of neutralize it that way. And then that gives you permission once in a while to complain about something. So I would really start there. The other thing is that don't overly focus on, you know, if there's a detractor for a particular project and your community is just starting to move forward, don't pick the toughest issue of the day for the first one to work on. You might get discouraged. So sometimes I found that working with detractors just means that you work on a different issue for a while, then you circle back to it. It's amazing how often people change their mind. I mentioned too that once a year you have a celebratory dinner or something, and that's where maybe some of your detractors did something good. You give them an award or something like that, sort of the Wizard of Oz approach. And that said, there is a big place, of course, for just sitting down with your detractors and talking and doing the best you can. I've seen mediation brought in, and that can be effective. That said, you'll make a lot of progress. Don't feel bad if there's always a few detractors. That's certainly going to happen. That's just part of the landscape.
Okay. When a large advocacy group has become negatively perceived, for example, it's the same 1 or 2 voices, how do you turn it around to return to a position of being heard and paid attention to?
Well, I would go through all the points I made and identify those things you're not doing correctly and make those changes. You know, it starts with involving more people. It starts with thank you notes and praise and you know, all the things I mentioned. So you know, go through the checklist of all the things I mentioned. The things you're doing well, continue to do well. The things that you're not doing well, just start changing them tomorrow. And you know, you can change the face of an organization over a period of a year or so. You just have to be very purposeful about it. keep track of what you're doing and stay focused on making those changes.
All right. For advocacy groups, you want transparency and openness, but you don't want people who may be disruptive or focus on a pet issue. How do you balance the two issues?
That's a really good question, and I think it really gets back to setting up meetings correctly, and that means having a strong chair. It means having an agenda. It means having a place for comment and having a place for public comment. So, every group's going to have a challenging member, a challenging person from the public, somebody that's a bit dysfunctional, and having a conversation about how often you should talk, how long you should talk, conversation about making sure that everybody is included, and the chair can set the tone on this. So if quite often what I'll do is work with a chair, and at the beginning of the meeting, if some of those kinds of issues are emerging, I always suggest to the chair is, okay, kind of just in a very friendly way, lay out some of the ground rules of this is how we're going to operate as a group. Disagreement's fine, but this is how we're going to do it. And stay to those rules. So it really comes down to some good facilitation. The other is just things like how do you sit. So say you're in a boardroom and there's people who are on a particular board and then there's visitors. Make sure that the people who are on, say, a bike advisory board or a pedestrian advisory board or your advocacy group sit around the table. And then if you have visitors, there's chairs for them. But they don't sit at the table and start participating as members. And I've seen that happen, and then groups get totally dysfunctional because there's people who aren't even members of the group that are taking over the conversation. So just physically how you set it up is important. And then, again, on the agenda, make sure that everybody knows from the very get-go that there's going to be a place where they get to speak their piece.
Okay. The next question. What do you recommend for small communities with no capacity within the municipality to lead an advisory group? For example, communities without a bicycle or pedestrian coordinator, an understaffed planning department that may not be very knowledgeable on pedestrian or bicycle issues.
Yeah, and that's a good question, and there are a lot of small communities who just are not going to have the staff capacity to to staff a group. And I think first what you try to do is still get a group going, and it just means that you're going to do all the work yourself and not have staff provide a lot of support, and that's okay. I've seen a number of times where there are pedestrian and bike advisory groups that are officially recognized, appointed, and the community is just so small, they don't get any official staffing. It just means they have to do more of the work themselves, and they have to be a little more focused on getting up to speed, a little more self-education, a little more awareness, but it certainly can be done. I wouldn't look at that as a fatal flaw.
What type of training do you recommend to help board members be more actively engaged and take a greater role in advancing the work of the advocacy group or committee?
Yeah, I'd just go back a little bit to what I mentioned before, once or twice a year, that you really want to provide some training. And depending on where the board is in their development, if you will, as a board, they might need slightly different kinds of training. But the different kinds of training to get people involved are, one is some of the things that I've been talking about, just sort of the logistics of first of all, how do you establish a common vision, a goal of where you want to go, the logistics of making sure that every single person on a board is assigned, and I didn't really talk about this, but is assigned 2 or 3 projects so they get ownership of it. Say you identify in your community there's 20 different things as a board that you want to follow that are important. Those 20 things should be divvied up so that every board member, say, gets 2 of them. And then when you do your weekly meetings, or your monthly meetings, I mean, you report back on that issue. And so you get a lot of ownership of that. You become an expert in that. And of course, from the staffing side, local government likes it because they always know who to call, who's the contact person for this issue. So those are the kinds of training things that you can do at a half-day training, just to walk through it and really understand how you want to organize and to really assign and give people important roles so that they're really valued members. So that's the logistical side of training. There's also kind of a planning design side of training, and I think this one can be equally important, completely different, where you say you're a pedestrian advisory board and do a half-day training on what kinds of treatments, for example, are most likely to reduce pedestrian crashes involving motor vehicles, and where should you put your energy. So the example I like to provide is sidewalks are wonderful, we should build them, but if you can't get across the street, it's not going to reduce crashes that much because most people are hurt crossing the street, not walking along the street, statistically. So it's partly is having those conversations about how do we get people safely across the street, and what are the countermeasures, what are the things that are most effective in reducing crashes. Some things are nice, but they don't statistically make a difference, and some they do. So where I'm going with this is that you really want informed volunteers who understand what kinds of things are worth advocating for depending on what their goals are. So it could be focused on safety. It could be focused on just getting more people bicycling more often, and we know what needs to be done to do that. There's been a lot of research out there. It's a matter of bringing that good research to the volunteers so that they really are informed volunteers.
All right, thank you. In your experience, can county-level advisory boards be effective, or is it better to be more local, such as the city or town level?
It's a good question, and I'm going to be a little evasive on this one, and the answer is it depends, because it depends what roles the counties have. Some communities, say in a growing area, as local jurisdictions grow, they take over most of the transportation, and so the role of the county may be diminishing and not that much, maybe just relegated to a few rural areas. In that case, maybe you don't need something at the county level. Other communities, most of the major roads are county roads, even if they're within the jurisdiction of a local, say, city, and that doesn't change. And so it may be very, very important to have a bike or a pedestrian advisory board at the county level. So it really depends on the local situation.
Okay. Is it possible to create a group that combines the attributes of an advisory and an advocacy group?
Anything's possible. And I think especially in really small communities where you don't have that many people, and there may be a limited capacity to recruit and have enough people for two different groups, it probably makes a lot of sense to combine them. I think when you get into medium to bigger communities, I would suggest having both. At least my experience has been that communities that really change over time do both, because they really serve fundamentally different roles in terms of one is being more establishment, sort of you've institutionalized it, the other one having a little more permission to push a little harder from the outside, if you will. So I think in a bigger community, both, and a smaller community, certainly it can work really well to combine.
All right. Would you suggest creating a schedule for when the 25 advocates agree to write a blog or email to spread it out more evenly across a year?
Yeah, I would create a schedule for your group of 25 for all the things you're going to do. I would definitely create a schedule, and I would check as you go through it, and then it allows you at the end of the year to celebrate and say, look, we set up a schedule, we hit all our targets, and that way you're ubiquitous. You're everywhere all the time, like I mentioned, every week of the year, something related to walking or biking is been brought forth to the front of the public eye. So absolutely set that up. It's a good way to move forward.
All right, thank you. What is an effective way to recruit board members in a community where you aren't familiar with the people or you are new?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different ways of recruiting board members. One is you do want to do the general advertising, because you always want a message that anyone can apply and join. You always want a message that this is transparent and that this is, we aren't leaving people out. So that part of the messaging, even if that doesn't result in anybody applying, you always do it. And that messaging needs to get out to as many groups as possible. One of the things that I like to do is I like to use the word resenders groups. In other words, find organizations that will take your little want ad, if you will, for people on your pedestrian board or your bike board, and send it to their members. So you're not going to a group and saying, can we have your mailing list? You're saying, here's something prepared, ready to go. We need members. Can you send it out on your mailing list? And people almost always say yes. So I always start by just having very good resenders list. And again, the process is the product. So even whether you get people that way or not, it's still a good thing to do, because you're telling hundreds, if not thousands of people that you're putting together a pedestrian or a bike advisory board, and it's a way of getting the word out. So think of recruitment as publicity in terms of getting that out. So that's one thing you're going to do. The other thing is attend existing groups and start flagging good people. I just keep, I read the, whenever I go to a community meeting, whenever I go to another board meeting of a different kind, read the newspaper. I just keep lists of people that, boy, these look like really capable, smart people who have passion for their community, and I keep lists of people. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with targeting people, calling them up and say, hey, we got a position open. Seeing you in action, you're really good, and would you apply to be on this board? So that personal request, I think, is very important. And then also remember, too, sometimes it's not what you say, but who says it. So, if there's a person who's in a position of authority who can make that phone call and ask people to be on a board, or you get a call from the mayor, and the mayor says, could you serve on this? You're going to give it more consideration than if I call them. So it may take 6 months or a year to kind of build up those lists, but read the newspaper, get publicly involved, and you'll find the people.
All right. In many towns, particularly small towns, street issues are related to state highways. Do you find it more effective to advocate directly to DOT or to advocate with local planners to take on the activity?
And again, there it's going to sort of depend, because it depends on kind of the relationship that your local community has with your state agency. But in general, I would start with your local community, because they're going to have a relationship with your state agency, and they're probably going to have some of the same questions and concerns. And what you don't want to do is have local advocacy groups kind of going around the backs of your local folks and going straight to the state agency, and then all of a sudden the local folks will feel, I'm left out. What's going on here? So there's nothing wrong with an advocacy group working directly with the state, but it should be done with full knowledge and involvement with the local agency, so that to the extent it can be collaborative, no surprises, I think you're going to get a lot better results.
All right, thank you. Next question. How do you deal with a bike advisory committee whose members no longer trust the municipal staff?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I sort of outlined how you avoid that in the first place. But once you get there, how do you rebuild that trust? is really difficult. And I think that's sometimes where maybe you need to bring in an outside mediator, facilitator, and really sit down and find out why that trust has been broken. Was it just around one big project where people felt misled or got bad information? Or is it a larger issue related just to ongoing communication? Is it related to a lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities? Is it, there could be a person on the bike or pedestrian board who's just really dysfunctional and has gone off on their own and gotten everybody grumpy. You really need to identify why the distrust has happened, and then you've got to sit down and be purposeful about identifying, okay, what are we going to do differently to change the situation?
All right. How important is it to provide food to public meetings?
I think it's really important. And I know it's a challenge with tight budgets, and I know it's a challenge. It's not even allowed in a lot of communities, but that said, certainly having just water, coffee, tea, soft drinks sometimes, whatever the case may be, and snacks, if you can do it. On average, and I've just been to hundreds of meetings over the years, people are happier when they're a bit watered and fed, and it just sets a tone of welcoming. And again, it can be something official that, say, an agency does, or again, as I mentioned, when you're doing advocacy, you can take more or less of the potluck approach. Everybody brings a few cookies and whatever you're going to have and participate that way. But I would give it pretty high priority in terms of the social and fun aspects of maintaining ongoing collaborative relationships and involvement over time.
All right. And if you still have a question, please enter it in the question box. How do you decide if an advocacy group should recommend an advisory group and disband or work in coordination?
Well, if you have an effective advocacy group, I wouldn't disband, but there's nothing wrong with an advocacy group advocating for a formal pedestrian or bicycle advisory board. And so, and then just, following all the guidelines I've talked about today in terms of meeting with people, talking about why it's important, and probably the one thing you'll need to do is find a champion for it, because if you're going to create something, say, legislatively, then you're going to need somebody who can introduce the legislation, who can speak to it, advocate for it. So a lot of times I think, too, the best strategy is going to be finding 1, 2, 3 champions who will take up your cause.
All right. Some public works staff consistently avoid any input from advisory boards. How would you approach building a more accepting relationship with that person?
Well, that's pretty going to be pretty nuanced depending on the situation. Sometimes you just find a way to work with other people. Don't take. Sometimes there's gatekeepers who just are not going to change at least in the short term, and you just need to find other people to work with, other projects to work on. Sometimes you end up doing that. On the other hand, never give up on people. People do change. I can think of a couple situations that I was involved in where there were gatekeepers in key positions that it just looked like nothing good was going to happen for walking and bicycling. And, we just find the 1 or 2 things that people are doing, everybody's doing something good, and send a complimentary letter, give them an award, invite them to a banquet. Really engage them in a positive way so they know that they're going to get recognized when they do good things. And so, it's just all the basic human nature kinds of things. So you can, 2 courses of action is, again, as you continue to work with that person, and then you find and and then other times you're just going to have to find other people to work with, and over time have it change. And I know that's not always a very satisfying answer, because that could take time and it can be frustrating, but for your group, you really have to find things that you can be successful at. And so sometimes individual people are the barrier, and then you just have to change course, change tactics a little bit.
All right. The next question, are corporate sponsorships of advisory groups or meetings a good idea?
Well, if you have a formal bike advisory group or pedestrian advisory group, I would probably not get the corporate sponsorship there, because it really needs to be untainted and represent the city, your advisory. That said, I think there's a huge role for public-private partnerships, for getting business involved in all sorts of good things related to bicycling and walking. There's probably a lot of opportunities, for example, on the advocacy side, where businesses can become involved. Obviously, things like bike share. Well, that's not advocacy, that's with local government, but that would be a good example of public-private partnership in terms of, say, promoting bike share. They can also, corporations can sponsor special events like mass rides, that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for that collaboration. Probably wouldn't do it directly with a bike or ped group, but certainly advisory group, but certainly you could do it with an advocacy group.
All right, I think this will be the last question for today. If you have a multimodal advisory committee or board, what suggestions would you offer to help set agendas throughout the year to address all user groups?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's something I didn't talk about, and it comes up quite often. I'll just jump to, you just back up here, Mitt. One of the urban myths out there is that, there's this sort of collective sigh and saying, gosh, we have to make tough choices. And it's always this, this idea that, are we going to accommodate the pedestrians, the bicyclists, or the motorists? And it's a false choice, and it's a myth that you have to always decide. Now, there's a few things that you do make tough choices on, but there's so many treatments and things we can do in the urban environment that are a win for all modes, that's really more the norm. And so when I have a group like that and they feel kind of stuck, like, who wins here? Quite often what I'll do is just focus on, okay, let's look at all the different things that we can do in the urban environment, and let's identify a dozen things that benefit all modes that we can all agree on, and focus on those first. And then secondarily focus on where there's some tough choices to be made. But very, very often, I think it's a bit of a misnomer and a myth, and really look for that common ground, and that comes really through looking at the research, looking at the data, and really understanding that so many things we do really benefit everyone.
All right, well, that's about all the time we have for discussion today. I'm sorry if we did not get to your question. A PDF copy of the presentation slides will be available later this week at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars, and a recording of today's program will be posted to that site, as well as to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/pedbikeinfo, within a couple of weeks. Be sure to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/pedbike for updates. Finally, I want to remind you that a very brief survey will appear once the webinar is ended. Again, we much appreciate you taking a moment to complete it. Lastly, I want to thank our speaker, Peter Lagerwey, and thank all of you for attending our webinar today.